Hi everybody, I'm Jack the Rambling Raconteur, and this will be my final discussion from Richard Wright's Native Son, Book 3, Fate. An outstanding book, a very challenging book, not in the sense of complex vocabulary, allusions, and all sorts of, puns going on that you find in a lot of complex books, but more just a complex book in that it's very challenging. It makes demands on how we as human beings relate to other human beings. It's an outstanding novel though, and definitely one well worth reading if you never have. So I've been reading this with Alan over at Big Hard Books and Classics, and I'll link his videos and then my discussions from Book 1, Fear, and Book 2, Flight in the discussion box below. And if there's any theme from Book 3 of Native Son, for me the takeaway is this sort of actionable item, which is it's really important as a human being when you relate to another human being to impute dignity to that person. And one of the ways that we do that is when we ask questions to that person that help that person, identify what are his or her aspirations, what are goals, what are dreams that a person has, and what can that person do to reach those dreams? How do we, through our questions and the care we show to another person, how do we help that person have more dignity and come closer to realizing those goals? So into the book now. So at the very end of Book 2, we have this chasing where Bigger is finally caught by the police. And of course he's wanted for the murder, and the media and the police are suspecting, because it was a young black man who killed a young white woman, that automatically the assumption is he raped her before murdering her. Now we know of course he didn't rape her, and that her death was really an accident. He didn't plan to murder her, and that an accident occurred. So with that, now Bigger's in jail, and we have this really, the first two books, the first 2/3 of the book occur across about 72 hours, and then Book 3 stretches out. So we've had this thrilling, non-stop pulsing book that keeps just banging, 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 and then suddenly we get to Book 3 and it stretches out. But we do have this really outstanding paragraph where we're in Bigger's mind. Having been thrown by an accidental murder into a position where he had sensed a possible order and meaning in his relations with the people about him, having accepted the moral guilt and responsibility for that murder because it had made him feel free for the first time in his life, having felt in his heart some obscure need to be at home with people, and having demanded ransom money to enable him to do it, having done all this and failed, he chose not to struggle anymore. With a supreme act of will springing from the essence of his being, he turned away from his life and the long train of disastrous consequences that had flowed from it, and looked wistfully upon the dark face of ancient waters, upon which some spirit had breathed and created him, the dark face of the waters from which he had been first made in the image of a man, with a man's obscure need and urge, feeling that he wanted to sink back into those waters and rest eternally. And so we find this new consciousness across Bigger. And this is part of the controversy of Native Son, is that one of the things Wright shows us is that with the environment Bigger has grown up in, he has so few aspirations. And we see that later with his lawyer and his conversations with his lawyer, Mr. Max, where Mr. Max asks him questions. And as Bigger responds, it becomes clear that, as I point out in Book 1, there isn't a lot of hope. There isn't a lot of aspiration for these boys and these young men as they're growing up there in these extraordinarily poor areas. They don't see other individuals like them. They don't see businesses, for the most part, owned by black individuals. They're owned by white individuals who, then collect the money, and the wealth, what little there is from, the black families and the black men who live in those neighborhoods. And at one point, Mr. Max asks Bigger, what did you want to do? And Bigger talks about this idea that he wanted to be an aviator. He wanted to be a pilot, which is about as we of course now think that's a very complex career, and that is certainly a deep aspiration for Bigger. And so Mr. Max asks him some questions, and Bigger points out quite truthfully, well, the military is segregated. That's a Jim Crow military. I don't want to go be part of that. And it's important to note that in the lead up to Pearl Harbor, there actually were some serious incidents of racism within the military, particularly at Fort Bragg, and particularly involving white military police with black soldiers who had not been in the Jim Crow South. They had been, they'd grown up in the North. And when they encountered the realities of the Jim Crow South in the military in the South, they were astonished by it. And, sort of like, this is wrong and this is nonsense. So Bigger points that out. And we then go from there, we get into this period of like the trial. So there is, of course, a scene where Bigger's like, interrogated by the state's attorney. And Jan, who Bigger had at one point tried to blame for Mary's death, is now going to bring in a lawyer who has worked, of course, with Jan and the Communist Party and the trade unions to defend Bigger. And the lawyer, and this is an important part, the lawyer uses the Leopold and Loeb Clarence Darrow defense, which is, we'll enter a plea of guilty, and that will allow us to, we only have to deal with the judge then. We don't have to deal with the jury, because there is no way a jury will acquit Bigger Thomas. And we see that the press quotes examples. And for Wright, these are real life examples. So Wright's uncle, who he had lived with for a while in, I believe it was Arkansas, eastern Arkansas along the Mississippi River, it's an unsolved mystery, but is likely was lynched and murdered by some white men who just wanted to take over his business. So Bigger, they quote like someone who knew Bigger when he was a boy down in Mississippi about like, oh, we know how to deal with that down here. And they're Wright periodically will show us like, this mob of people who are screaming like they want Bigger. They flat out say lynch him. They use the N-word. They call him a hairy ape. All sorts of things of dehumanizing Bigger Thomas and just wanting to murder him. At one point, the true crime Bigger committed was, when he raped and murdered Bessie, his girlfriend, in book 2. And that's like not touched on in the courtroom, in the inquest. Her body is suddenly wheeled out, but it's really just there. It very much is a message from Wright about how not only racist but sexist aspects of society can be, where Bessie is her death and murder and rape are not really viewed in any sense of like a crime worth prosecuting. It's more just corroboration of what he must have done to Mary Dalton. So that all occurs, and then we get into the courtroom, and we have like I mentioned, it's very much the Leopold and Loeb, who famously did not receive the death penalty. They both received life in prison after Clarence Darrow argued they're guilty, but we shouldn't kill them. It doesn't accomplish anything. Mr. Max makes the exact same argument. And he has this is where Wright shows his sort of like naturalist school. And I mentioned that in a previous video where I talked about Stephen Crane's short story, The Blue Hotel, where this concept of when a crime is committed, it's not just the criminal who commits it, but it's everything that led up to that criminal being driven to commit it. That there are events that have happened to that person that led to that point. And that's what Mr. Max is doing. And it's fascinating that Wright only ever allows us into Bigger Thomas's mind throughout the book. But when he makes this argument, he makes it through the voice of a white lawyer, a Jewish lawyer, but a white lawyer on behalf of Bigger. And there's this, it's quite a long sort of defense that Mr. Max provides, but I'll read just one short paragraph here. We must deal here with the raw stuff of life, emotions and impulses and attitudes as yet unconditioned by the strivings of science and civilization. We must deal here with a first wrong, which when committed by us, and this is Mr. Max who's talking about white individuals, was understandable and inevitable. And then we must deal with the long trailing black sense of guilt stemming from that wrong, a sense of guilt which self-interest and fear would not let us atone. And we must deal here with the hot blasts of hate engendered in others by that first wrong, and then the monstrous and horrible crimes flowing from that hate, a hate which has seeped down into the hearts and molded the deepest and most delicate sensibilities of multitudes. We must deal here with a dislocation of life involving millions of people, a dislocation so vast as to stagger the imagination, so fraught with tragic consequences as to make us rather not want to look at it or think of it, so old that we would rather try to view it as an order of nature and strive with uneasy conscience and false moral fervor to keep it so. And of course he's talking about slavery and the evil of slavery, and he makes a point of, if it was just for a couple years, or if it was just with a couple of people, you would say it's an injustice, an act of injustice. But when it's for hundreds of years, and it's with millions of people, and he doesn't go into the horrors of slavery, but he doesn't need to. That's not just an act of injustice, that's a system of oppression. And so Wright has Mr. Max lay out this whole case of, all of this systematic oppression happened, but then it's more specific. So at one point during the inquest, he actually asks Mr. Dalton, who famously has given money to the Relief, Foundation, who has paid for the education of various, black employees they've had, who of course gives a job to Bigger and is then betrayed by him. And he points out, Mr. Dalton owns that slum building that is, we saw in book 1, it's a terrible place to live. It's smaller than the room that entire family is living in is smaller than the room I'm sitting in right now. Mr. Dalton owns that building, and he charges, we're told how much rent he charges for it. And it's absurd. And Mr. Max points out, how come are the only properties you own over on the south side where all of the black families have to live? And he says, no, I've got those. Well, how come you don't rent to the white families in that part of town? Well, there are customs. And he's like, so? And Mr. Arlo, I didn't make the customs, but you're not doing anything. And of course, we have the state prosecutor who is up for re-election, this coming up. And the prosecutor had demanded that Mr. Max not refer to Bigger Thomas as this poor boy, Bigger Thomas, and the judge upheld that. This is then how the state's attorney speaks. Your Honor, I regret that the defense has raised the viperous issue of race and class hate in this trial. I sympathize with those whose hearts were pained as mine was pained when Mr. Max so cynically assailed our sacred customs. It is a sad day for American civilization when a white man will try to stay the hand of justice from a bestial monstrosity who has ravished and struck down one of the finest and most delicate flowers of our womanhood. Every decent white man in America ought to swoon with joy for the opportunity to crush with his heel the woolly head of this black lizard, to keep him from scuttling on his belly farther over the earth and spitting forth his venom of death. And he's talking about Bigger Thomas, the 20-year-old black man who we've spent the past 400-ish pages in the mind of. And who we've seen in all of his faults and the crimes he has committed, the crimes he has planned, not the specific crime for which he is convicted and later executed. We've seen his dreams, though. And he's a deeply, deeply flawed character. Alan pointed out, one of the real magical pieces of Wright's writing is, despite showing us all of the bad things Bigger is capable of, and then Bigger does, we also see enough of Bigger in his mind and his consciousness to care about him, and to at times feel sympathy, with him, or empathy for him. And so that passage, really pushes at what Wright, as a black individual growing up, both in the Jim Crow South and then later as a teenager and like in his 20s in Chicago, did actually experience. And so we then are, Bigger is sentenced to death, unlike Leopold and Loeb. And despite a defense speech that, cribs a little bit from Clarence Darrow, but definitely goes in a different direction to explore that naturalist aspect of society. And at the very end, that last evening in his jail cell, Bigger and Mr. Max have another conversation. Bigger finally explains to Mr. Max, how much it meant to him to be asked about his dreams, how much it meant to be asked those questions that made him realize he was a human being. And Mr. Max doesn't quite get, he feels like Bigger's trying to be brave or, trying not to show weakness, but he doesn't quite understand what it is that has driven Bigger to this point. But Bigger is actually grateful that there was a person who was willing to treat him as a human being. He never quite articulates it that way, It's a really fascinating aspect, and it's of course a wonderful book. So well worth reading. But again, challenging book. There is in book 2 there's a description of a rape and a murder. In book 1 there's a fairly graphic dismemberment scene, and books 1, 2, and 3 all deal with serious racism that existed in Chicago. And so a couple of other books then to sort of jump off from. One that I highly recommend, one that I read between my first read of Native Son and this time when I read it here in 2020, is Wright's autobiography, Black Boy, particularly if you can find both books 1 and 2. The second part is called American Hunger. Library of America publishes it as together as Black Boy. Sometimes you find them as separate paperbacks. That's his autobiography, though. It's excellent. Sort of the spiritual sequel to Native Son in some ways is Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, an outstanding novel. Like Native Son, one of the best ever published in the United States. In terms of sort of that naturalism, 2 writers. Wright's a better writer than Emile Zola, but if you've read Emile Zola and thought it was like some of the ideas were interesting, you might really enjoy Wright. And then of course Stephen Crane was sort of the dean of United States naturalism, literary naturalism, and his stories and novels kind of push in that direction as well. A more happy, hopeful book would be this is a cool volume called Black Eagles by Jim Haskins. Yeah, Jim Haskins. And it's one of my older daughter's favorites. It's about African American aviators and astronauts. So, not just the Tuskegee Airmen. Really outstanding. And then if you're interested in sort of that like housing, the housing aspect and segregated housing, which was common throughout the United States, and existed here in Phoenix as well. A really great play or film or to either read or watch is A Raisin in the Sun by Lorraine Hansberry, whose family was breaking the redlining, the segregated housing in Chicago at the exact same time as Richard Wright was writing Native Son. It even went up to the Supreme Court, and she wrote the play A Raisin in the Sun, which deals with that same aspect of a black family looking, for hope and having a dream. So that was Native Son by Richard Wright. This was book 3. I know this was a little long, but it's a dense and important book. And again, as we realize from Bigger, the whole point is go out, talk to someone, ask questions, help that person understand that he or she is a person. And that's an important thing that any of us can do at any time. So thank you. Best.